Mais vous voulez qu'on aille se mettre là-bas pour parler ou qu'on reste là? Non, on reste là. Non, oui, non, on reste là. Oui, oui.
Welcome to everybody to the second session of this conferences series about European election. The first one was focused on Brexit, and the second one will raise the question of institutional reforms. First of all, I would like to thank very warmly our three speakers. I will introduce them very, very briefly because we don't have a lot of time and we need to have time to have a deep discussion after they speak. On my left, Henrik Enderlein is professor of political economy at the Hertie School of Governance and is in fact president of the Hertie School and is an economist, a German economist. And Thomas Piketty, who is also an economist, who is professor at l'EHESS and at Paris School of Economy. And he will speak about his project and his manifesto, the Democratization de l'Europe. And we have, lastly, Cornelia Woll, who is not an economist, who is a political scientist, who is professor at Sciences Po in political science, but she's also an expert on political economy. So we will organize the discussion this way. First of all, I think Thomas Piketty will speak for around 20 minutes, and after Henrik Enderlein will have 10 minutes to answer, maybe, or to comment, and we will finish with the speak of Cornelia Woll, and after we will have a large discussion with you, and so you have to prepare questions for the second part of the conference. Thomas Piketty, I'll leave you the floor.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for being here tonight. Yes, this is working. So let me first apologize for the fact that my English doesn't really sound like English, but at least those of you who are French-speaking will recognize the music, and I hope everybody will be able to understand more or less what I have to say. So this presentation is going to be about this manifesto for the democratization of Europe that we have put online a couple of months ago in December. So please go online. The website is tdem.eu, like European Union. We already have, in a couple of weeks, we got more than 100,000 signatures. So this is less than the Yellow Vest, who got a bit more than 1 million. But at the same time, in terms of media coverage, I think it's fair to say that we didn't get much. And also, a proposal proposing a new treaty for a new federal organization of Europe is somewhat less sexy than the immediate demand of, suppressing the carbon tax, etc. So I think what this suggests to me, I don't want to be too, sound, triumphalist or whatever with this, but is that there is some demand for hope in Europe. Many people are tired to hear that nothing is possible, that nothing will ever change, that the current institutions of Europe are here for many decades, which makes no sense because, institutions in Europe, treaties in Europe change all the time, they will keep changing all the time. So instead of waiting for the next crisis in order to draft a new treaty in 3 weeks, which was what happened in 2011, 2012, I think it's important to think about it ahead of time without waiting the financial crisis or the political crisis or whatever crisis will happen. And to think about how we want to organize Europe. So the key issue in our manifesto for the democratization of Europe is not really the institution per se, but what we can do with the institution, of course. And the key issue is really fiscal justice. Okay, so it's in a way it's very close to the Yellow Vest movement because the Yellow Vest movement is a lot of things at the same time, some good things, some bad things. It's sometimes very confusing. But certainly the starting point, we all know about it, the starting point was we don't want to pay this increase in carbon tax. We don't want to pay the increase in CSG, this proportional income tax on pension income. What I hear also, people I know, my mother, who is a retired primary school teacher in Enderlein, who uses their car a lot, so, very representative of that kind of movement. It's not that people don't want to pay carbon tax or CSG, it's that they feel, okay, I'm ready to pay a bit more, but if the money is used to pay for the suppression of the wealth tax, is it really the best we can do, the best policy? You have thought a lot about it, this is really your last word. So I think this was really the most stupid way of introducing a carbon tax. And in addition to this specific French component with this suppression of the wealth tax, I think it's important to realize that because of the lack of fiscal coordination of Europe, the kind of carbon tax that we currently have in France or in other countries is really completely crazy, in the sense that you're going to tax at full rate someone who takes his car in Indre-et-Loire to go to work, and then someone who takes a plane to go to Rome for the weekend and uses kerosene, there's no tax on the carbon emission of kerosene. And then you want to explain people that this is fair, that they should pay, that they should stop being, against the climate, etc. But, from the beginning, this is crazy. It's okay to tax every carbon emission, but then it should be every carbon emission, and if anything, you should probably tax a bit more the highest emitters of carbon than the lowest emitter of carbon. So when you do exactly the opposite, what do you... And I take this example because, in fact, the first time I think it was in November that I heard one of the Yellow Vest demonstrators, saying to someone on TV that, kerosene doesn't pay any carbon tax, but, fuel on boats don't pay... Initially, I was not an expert on this, and, I thought, he's bullshitting, but, the journalist is going to explain him that this is wrong. And then, I realized, like everybody, that it was true. And this is true because there is a European agreement that kerosene should be taxed at zero. Okay? So now, if we think we have a chance of solving our problem with that kind of Europe, I think we are in a really bad situation. Okay? It's not only the issue of carbon taxation. I think more generally, tax competition in Europe has clearly been against, the more disadvantaged socio-economic groups, bottom wages, middle wages, because tax competition to attract high incomes, to attract high owners of wealth, in the end implies always more taxation on the bottom wage group, middle wage group, more indirect taxation. Carbon tax is one example. This is supposed to solve the climate, but in practice, 3/4 of it was paying for the general budget, which today, everybody say, this was a big mistake, but, 2 years ago, people told the Macron campaign this is a big mistake, and people were saying, no, this is so smart. Okay, so, we are so accustomed to the idea that tax competition has to work for the people at the top of the distribution, and that the people in the bottom and the middle have to accept this, that we don't realize that, no, people won't accept this. And, there's a possibility that already today, the negative effect of tax competition on the bottom 50% group in Europe or bottom 60 or 70% group in Europe are actually bigger than the positive effect, due to European integration, trade, etc. Which, look, I believe in Europe, and the possibility that, in fact, it can be negative, the net effect on the bottom 60% of the population can be negative, I think nobody knows, in fact, because the benefits of trade integration, we all know they are positive. How big are they exactly for the bottom 60% is complicated. But at least I can tell you that the cost of tax competition are enormous in terms of extra tax they pay and less tax for the top of the distribution. So there is a possibility, and if it's not true today, it will be true in 10 years, that, tax competition makes Europe as a whole a bad deal for the bottom groups in Europe. So, this means that, we have to stop saying, okay, these people, vote against Europe referendum after referendum, 1992 Maastricht referendum in France, 2005, but this is just because they are stupid, racist, irrational, they are not good progressive people, so we should just wait for them to become better people. This is crazy. Okay, so now what do we do? Well, I think the first thing is that we are not going to get 27 or 28 countries to agree on dropping the veto on tax issues and dropping the unanimity rule on tax issues. You know, for a long time, people said, oh, we are going to manage to make some, cooperation within the EU 28, or well, now it's EU 27, so I don't know if we need to wait until EU becomes 20 or 15, but, I think we can keep saying this is going to work, we're going to use, reinforced cooperation scheme, look, this will work. No, this will not work. So we can again meet in 10 years and say, oh, this is too sad, this didn't work. But I think at some point, you have to decide that a smaller number of countries have to build separate political institutions, because this is what it takes to have taxation. Okay? You cannot have taxation without representation, you cannot have taxation without something like a parliament. You will never have a tax voted by two heads of state voting a tax, voting a tax base, the tax rate is complicated. You need a parliament to do that. That's not going to be the European Parliament with 27 countries, at least not in the foreseeable future. So we have to do something. So to present what we propose in our manifesto for the democratization of Europe, let me actually start from a proposal that was made, this is an article in a treaty between two countries, France and Germany, that was agreed upon in January. This is a new version of the so-called Élysée Treaty. So the Traité de l'Élysée, Élysée Treaty was the treaty first signed like 60 years ago by France and Germany in 1959, and it had to be renewed in 2019, and it is renewed periodically. And Merkel and Macron, people said, well, there's nothing in the new treaty. Well, it's always more complicated than there's nothing. There's always something. So I want to be positive, and I want to take some of the ingredients in it and see how it could be better. One of the proposals, well, it's not a proposal, it's an article in the treaty, is to create what they call a French-German Parliamentary Assembly, Assemblée parlementaire franco-allemande, which will be made of about 100 members of parliament, about half from the French Assemblée nationale, half from the German Bundestag. And this French-German assembly will talk about a number of issues, including, initially it was supposed to be more defense, foreign affairs, but now it seems to be that the project is moving also towards the direction of company law and probably social law. Now, this is potentially a very good idea, except that here this is an assembly that will have no power at all. It will just be purely consultative, so people will meet. Now, the problem is that we've already had a lot of assembly, to talk in Europe. The fact of putting together members of national parliament just to talk is something that we have done many times. I mean, it's always better to talk than not to talk, of course, but that's not enough. Okay? Now, the point is that France and Germany could very well have decided in this same treaty, without waiting for anybody else, to give to this French-German assembly the power to vote a certain number of tax, for instance, a common tax on carbon that would have a higher tax rate on the implicit emission of kerosene as compared to oil, a common corporate tax that would have a higher effective tax rate on large corporations rather than small corporations, a common, income tax, wealth tax that would have a higher tax rate on high incomes and low income. I mean, whatever they want. And so basically, this is our proposal. What our proposal is doing, what the Manifesto for the Democratization of Europe is doing, is saying, okay, let's do this French-German assembly, but first, it should not be consultative, it should have real power. So, of course, you don't want to give it full power to vote over all tax, own budget, but on some specific tax instrument on which we need coordination, you can just transfer the sovereignty to vote for this tax here. You can also, and this is what we propose in our treaty, put in the binding treaty that there will be no net transfer between the two countries, because of course this idea that the common taxation, common budget is all about taking the German money to France or Southern Europe this is a completely stupid idea invented by, nationalists are not always are not only in the National Front, nationalists are everywhere, okay? And they are in Germany, they are in France, there are lots of people who don't say they are nationalists, but they keep telling stories about, Southern Europe wants to take our money, we work so hard. This is not the issue. Okay, the issue when we talk about carbon taxation, taxing kerosene, or when we talk about taxing big corporations at least as much as small corporations, this is also an issue for Germany. Because the fact that in Germany kerosene is not taxed enough, or that small and medium-sized corporations pay a higher effective tax rate than large companies, this is not good. So the problem is not to have transfer between countries. The problem is to reduce inequality within country, within Germany, within France. So this is why in our project, there's an article which makes it explicit, which says, okay, when you compute the net contribution of each country, it must be less than 0.1% of GDP per year. You can put it 0.0001 if you want. You know, this is not the issue. Okay, and people who keep saying that this is the issue are people who want Europe to fail. And the problem is that there are many people like this because it is, doing business as usual, pretending that their country is doing everything fine, and every country can play this game. Germany sometimes plays this game. France very often plays this game as well. And the current discourse that we have in France, which is, oh, we have a great president who made a beautiful proposition to the rest of Europe, but this is too sad. The rest of Europe doesn't want this. This is also stupid nationalism because there's no precise proposal of any kind about a budget for the Eurozone. We don't know which tax will finance this budget. We don't know which parliament will vote for this tax. So, what is a budget without, if you don't know the tax, if you don't know who decides? So, of course, this is a kind of proposal which is very easy to dismiss because, anybody in the Netherlands or in Northern Europe or in Germany who don't like this kind of thing will say, well, look, they want our money. They didn't give any number, so this is the proof that they want a lot of money. So, if you make very imprecise proposal, it means that you are not serious about it, that you are just, this is taking space. And I'm sad that a big part of the French media is just, pretending that France is playing the good role and too bad, Germany is not playing the game and nobody's playing. So I think we have not started the debate. So I think, at least, this French-German assembly is a good starting point, except that, as I said, it needs to have real power. And the second big thing is that it cannot be just France and Germany, of course. You have to propose it right away to Italy, to Spain, to Eurozone countries, to whoever wants to enter. And, I think instead of having this stupid fight with the Italian government, which, of course, is a very strange government, it's a very weird coalition, but this coalition in Italy is also the product of Europe, and it has been created by a certain political, economic context. So if you are serious about Europe, the Eurozone, you cannot just do it with Germany. You have to talk to Italy, to Spain, and so this kind of common assembly proposal, if it starts just with France and Germany have a common corporate tax, it would already be much better than nothing at all. But I think it's important to make it broader. From the beginning. So this is basically what we are proposing. Of course, the ultimate objective is to have the 27 countries and even Britain come back, and of course. But I think it is time to be very concrete about how you can get there and about the fact that you can only start with a small number of countries, try to build trust, which is really the key problem. The situation in Europe today is that everybody, wants to give lesson to other countries, pretending that they don't do things well, and this is what's so sad. And so, if we don't want the nationalists to win, and I think they are taking momentum. I think we have to stop saying that nationalists are stupid, poor people who don't like Europe are stupid, and we should just wait for the situation to improve. The situation is not going to improve like this, just waiting. And so, this kind of proposal is not complicated. Again, the Élysée Treaty 2 months ago could have started giving real tax power to these two important countries, France and Germany, and move from there. So it's not a utopia, it's not complicated, but, the problem is to get people to be interested in this issue. The problem with institution, and I stop there, is that very often, once you start talking about institution, everybody stop listening and say, okay, this is so boring. Why are you talking about institution? Now, the fact that you are all here tonight shows that, at least you are interested, potentially. And, I think the real issues, of course, is not the institution in itself, but what it allows you to do. I already talked a lot about the tax dimension. Of course, the tax are here to do something. So they can, we cannot decide, the group of people from all over Europe who voted this manifesto, we cannot decide which budget is going to be adopted. So this will be the role of this assembly. We put a proposal, a specific proposal, where the total tax revenue will be about 4% of GDP, which is substantial. It could be 1, it could be 2, it could be 6. You could binding in the treaty if you're not happy for the assembly to decide how big it should be. The way we spend it in our proposal is to say we want to illustrate the flexibility of the scheme. So what we do is half of the new tax revenue are given back to the country so that, for instance, they can reduce other tax, if they want to reduce value-added tax or tax on bottom wages or middle wages. So then it's just an instrument to tax higher, bigger companies or higher income neighborhoods in order to reduce tax on the bottom and the middle, which is already quite important, especially at a time where total tax revenue are already quite high. Maybe you actually don't want to increase aggregate tax revenue. So maybe you could want to actually redistribute 100% of the new tax revenue. I mean, I would not have anything against that. That's a possibility. In our proposal, we redistribute half, and the other half finances basically the green technology investment in new sources of energy, research, European university and research. But okay, that's one way to do it, and we certainly don't pretend. This is a manifesto about the democratization of Europe, so this is not a proposal to be a dictator of Europe. So let me stop there. And let's talk.
Perfect for me. So, Henrik Enderlein, it's your turn to react.
Thank you, Florence. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. I realize I sit for the first time in my life on this side of Boutmy. I spent 3 years of my life sitting back there where you're sitting as a student, but this was a long time ago. So it actually feels quite nice. Thomas, we agree on many points. I thought for the purpose of discussing the issue, I would tell you why I would not sign the manifesto. And it's more an issue of method than an issue of fundamental issues. So I think we agree on many points, but I think the method you propose is just not the right one. And I'll tell you why. You call in the manifesto for an in-depth transformation of the European institutions and policies. And for me, as an institution person, someone interested in institution, the first thing you tell everyone is you never change institutions to change policies. Institutions should allow for different policies to be implemented, but the objective of changing a policy should never be the objective of changing the institution. And what you propose, this parliamentary assembly, is very much driven by the idea to just raise money and to circumvent the current institutions we have because they don't deliver the result you would like to see. And I think institutionally, that's not the right approach. Analytically, it's probably not the right approach because good institutions are compatible with all policies, and we just need to get the politics right, in that sense, not the institution. I'm also having difficulties with the term democratization you use, because I think it's not the right way to discuss democratization. You either say the European Union is not democratic today and we should democratize it. Well, I think this is quite a push in a direction to say the European Union is not a democratic system today. Now, you're legitimate to say, I would like to change the politics of the European Union, but then you don't call for democratization, you call for a change in politics. I don't have many American friends who tell me we need to democratize the United States of America in order to get rid of Donald Trump. They tell you we'd like to get rid of Donald Trump inside the institutional framework we have. So the word democratization, I think, is very much pushing into a direction of making this a slightly populist discourse, which I think is not appropriate for discussing the very right issues you have on your agenda and we should in fact discuss. So briefly, what would I like to talk about? First, and I couldn't resist to do a plan in deux parties and deux sous-parties. So I would first like to tell you that indeed the European Union needs an institutional overhaul, and this institutional overhaul can result from within the current institutional framework, and that's a big disagreement. And then I would, as a second part, point out that in order for this overhaul to work, we require political change, again, a lot of agreement here, but that this political change needs to be driven by France and Germany. So let me start with my first part. The EU indeed needs an institutional overhaul. You've mentioned many points. The taxation issue is an issue, but why have a new assembly? The European Parliament can be given taxing powers today, and it should. And this is an institutional flaw we have in the treaty right now. In fact, we have representation, but we have no taxation. I like to turn the phrase around and to say we should not have representation without taxation. So let's give the European Parliament own taxing powers as stated by the treaty. The treaty requires that the European Union should have own resources. We can give it to the European Union. That's not a problem. Second, again, we agree, get rid of unanimous voting. We know that majority voting in the European Union is much more successful. Draghi, the ECB, saved the euro area because they had majority voting and they could outvote Germany and some of the northern countries, and that was good. The EU today still doesn't have a unanimous position vis-à-vis Venezuela because one of the countries is blocking it. And so unanimous voting is just not right for the European Union today. And you mentioned the tax issues, absolutely right. Another area where we need to change is the European Commission needs to be turned into a really politically mandated executive of the European Union. And Juncker has pushed in this direction, but we haven't seen the translation of this. Some call the European Commission Coreper II, which is an assembly of state representatives meeting in an intergovernmental context and not as a full and political commission. Finally, EMU needs an institutional overhaul. It's an issue in which we both contributed in various contexts. I'm not going to go into details. We need a euro area budget for investment. We need a euro area finance minister, probably a double hat. Commission and Council, head of the Eurogroup. We need stronger political control of the Eurogroup and the ESM through an assembly in the European Parliament. I'll come back to it. And we need a number of additional fixes, which I, together with co-authors, described in a paper by French and German economists, 7 German, 7 French economists, the 7+7 paper. If you want to read the proposals, you can read that there. And I think the way this should work politically is inside the European Parliament, that we form a committee of European parliamentarians jointly with national parliamentarians controlling this European finance minister and providing inside the current institutional framework the legitimacy that is currently needed. This overhaul can result from within the institutions. EU politics has always been about bargaining, and so the EU budget can be a tool to push Ireland to accept cooperation on tax issues. Why create a new institution? The ESM could have been a tool. I've never understood why we've given financial aid to Ireland without asking for them giving up their veto on the tax issues. So I think if we play the institutional game in the European right, we don't need a new assembly, we don't need this democratization or to start from scratch. We can enable the existing framework to deliver much better things. What we need in this context is innovative proposals, not radical proposals. And your proposal in that respect is quite radical because it moves outside the current EU framework. We need, for example, a discussion on the EU budget. I think you can be innovative and say we can have a smaller EU budget, but with full flexibility and therefore less redistributive. We can have a stronger focus on EU public goods and thereby circumvent some of the problems we have. I think the European Parliament can play a very constructive role as an assembly and not be circumvented by a new assembly. If we have, after the elections, a coalition treaty in Europe, if we have a clear positioning by the Parliament saying we reject populist members of the Commission, the Parliament can do that. It can threaten to jointly reject the entire Commission. Then I think it can also play a much stronger role in the discussions about the next EU budget and solve some of the issues you raise in the treaty. And obviously the Commission can do that as well. So I think you can reform Europe from within the institutional framework. The question which you rightly ask is, why doesn't it happen? And that's my second part, and then I'll end. The overhaul requires political change. And the political change is difficult to reach. On that point, you are absolutely right. In many member states, the EU is still the trash bin of national politics. It's the perfect scapegoat, and that needs to change. On EMU, we know that in the south, the EU is criticized for austerity, and in the north, the ECB is criticized for this low interest rate policy. So they basically play this game of blame shifting. On the migrants, we had the same discussion that just needs to change. I think we both agree that we need to move away from this methodological nationalism in national politics, whereby we perceive everything as redistributive. We perceive everything in terms of juste retour, and for us, I think for both of us, the EU is not a zero-sum game. We need to make more out of the things we can have, but for that, again, politics needs to change. What needs to be shifted is the political acceptance of this multi-level governance approach, but that's something we can discuss later on. In contrast to you, I'm very confident that citizens can understand the logic I've just outlined. You basically said at one point, it's crazy to wait for people to change their opinions. For someone who pushes for democratization, I'm not sure this is the right route to take. If people are really following what you think, then we can do it inside the institutional framework. For me, that's democracy. So let's use these institutions and not invent new ones. Why do France and Germany need to play a very important role in pushing this European agenda? Well, Franco-German leadership is unavoidable. If you take just the 6 largest EU countries today and you briefly walk through them, you realize that Poland is a very pro-European country with a totally populist government right now that is not interested in deepening EU integration. Next is Spain. Spain is struggling with problems at home, both from secession and an unstable government. Next on the list is Italy, dominated today by 60% of populist votes. Next on the list is the UK, and I don't need to go into the details and the constitution from 1604. And then we're left with France and Germany, the only 2 countries. The problem with France and Germany is they know they're important, but they're very good only on the red carpet. They're not good when it comes to actual policy implementation. So they like to sign important treaties, but they never manage to actually implement this into real action. And here again, we probably agree, this parliamentary assembly could be the starting point, but inside the framework of pushing better cooperation between France and Germany. What we need is a true economic and social space. We need joint regulation. We need joint legislation. I'm often asked, what is the next Erebus in Europe? And my favorite answer is to say an identical legislation in France and Germany on data protection. It's as almost or probably as difficult, if not more difficult, than building an airplane to agree on this between France and Germany. But if we had it, we had a single regulation for data protection in a much bigger space. And so it's that bottom-up kind of approach which I think we need. And France and Germany could do a lot together on Schengen, on digital, on security, and on EMU. For that, the mutual blame game between the 2 countries has to end. Germany has blamed France far too long for not coming up with ideas. Then Macron came up with the Sorbonne speech and now the Renaissance letter, and Germany is just silent. And that is unacceptable, and we need to have a very clear common understanding that Germany and France need to push Europe together. So to conclude, we need to change the institutional framework, but I'm afraid it's not institution stupid, as it's written here, but it's politics stupid. We just need to work the politics in order to get the politics right and not change the institutions to get the politics right. So my fear is that by applying your manifesto, we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater and should instead work towards a renovation, some say renaissance, of the European Union project from within. And you can be equally radical. That was a provocation, and it was well received. The initiative needs to be Franco-German, and for me, just as a convinced European, I would say the EU today is not part of the problem, it's part of the solution. Thank you very much.
So I'm happy the discussion has started. Thank you. So Cornelia, you have to continue.
Thank you very much, Florence. Thank you for having me on the panel. I don't know if you noticed, I'm the odd one out, not because I'm the only political scientist, because really Henrik Enderlein is not an economist, although he's continuously described as one, but he did his PhD in the same place as I did in political science with one of Germany's most renowned federalists, but nobody remembers this. So if you will look anywhere, he's always described as an economist. I just wanted to set the record straight. Also, so that you see where we're coming from, which is not just our joint German perspective, which is also a thing we share, but which is a concern with political institutions. I would also like to start with an entrance that situates a bit this discussion in context, because with both Thomas and Henrik, you have people who have very much contributed to putting forward proposals to overhauling, in particular, Eurozone governance. And I think that is a very interesting discussion to actually spell out here. But before I would like to do so, I would like to go back a bit further into the context. We do have, I think, a joint, shared understanding that there is a problem that's been pointed to continuously with the technocratic European governance that has been very much revealed, in particular during the Eurozone crisis. Because there has been such extreme stress on, most notably, the common currency, but also the government's mechanisms that have been invented in order to deal with this crisis. The crisis revealed two things. The first was that European governments and institutions were completely unprepared to deal with such a massive challenge. And the second was that when they did then respond in a very technocratic way, they chose a number of options that had massive redistributive consequences. And Thomas is very right in saying if we are doing politics and policies, putting in place policies that have such massive distributive consequences, then somehow they need to be discussed somewhere, and that clearly hasn't been the case. So there we go with the problem that I think has been identified beyond academia also by a lot of European citizens and several movements, and that creates this need to overhaul the institutional architecture of the Eurozone first and foremost, and possibly beyond the Eurozone, the entire European Union. But beyond this common starting point or this joint diagnosis, the way that the proposals that Henrik Enderlein and Thomas Piketty have produced are in many ways very different. And to understand these differences, let me roll back a little bit into the analysis of what we generally describe as the democratic deficit of the European Union. There is a sense that the European Union produces policies and produces political results that are not in line with the public opinion and the sentiment of citizens within Europe. And that is, goes as this theme that's underlying much of the discussion. There is a democratic deficit. That's debated in academia, but it is most importantly debated also in real life by practitioners and by members of these European institutions. And it has been the reason for a series of reforms in the last at least 20 decades that have tried to respond to that challenge by extending the powers and prerogatives of the European Parliament, for example, making the co-decision procedure the normal legislative procedure, and creating more and more mechanisms for representation for the citizens of Europe through a variety of solutions. But the ambition to say, whatever you think of the European Union, it produces results that should be discussed in a forum have been tried to address insufficiently. We all agree on this, but under this label, the democratic deficit. Now, how you exactly approach this discussion depends very much on what you think the European Union is. And you can have two opinions because the European Union is a hybrid political regime. There are those that side on the intergovernmental side that say it is an international organization. And scholars like Andrew Moravchik say, and therefore there is no democratic deficit because the democratic deficit you might have in the production of these policies is a democratic deficit at the national level, and that's where it should be corrected. But the way in which governments then negotiate internationally is the same in the European Union as it would be in NATO or somewhere else. That's a minority position. Most scholars or other observers say, well, no, it really is much more than just an intergovernmental organization. It produces outputs that need some sort of public space and discussions, and they therefore push for the solutions that have led to all these different reforms. But my point here is just to say that the way in which you democratize the EU depends very much on what you think it is and it should be. And actually here, there's the first nuance that I will come to later. Second, more general point on Euroscepticism and this backlash that we observe, and that is very much also the context in which we watch the outcome of the upcoming European elections. There's an urgency to tackle the challenges that have been revealed in the Eurozone crisis because we feel that it has very real political results that kind of created a backlash that we want to address. And that is the general sense that citizens in Europe no longer trust the political institutions. They want a European Union that is different, that produces different outputs, and that is much regrouped under the label rise of popular parties or European skepticism. But in discussing this, I think it is important to remember that one has to distinguish between popular public opinion and between party competition and electoral dynamics. If you just look at public opinion, so you survey data, for example, you do not find something that would look like a drop in support for the integration, for the European regime as an institution. People don't say they like Europe less today than they did 20 years ago, across the European Union, by the way, which is possibly not the right question to ask. But if you also look at support for policy integration, would you like the European Union to speed up policy integration? You do not see a drop, the Europeans turning to be more Eurosceptic, you actually see a rise. And especially during the Eurozone crisis, the southern part of Europe wanted more policy integration rather than less, even though that is the moment of Euroscepticism. You see the same, by the way, for the common currency. Support for the common currency is still above 50% despite the Eurozone crisis, although here you do see a drop in the countries that have been most negatively affected during this crisis. My point in this is that there is the opinion that you can get through survey data, but there's something else going on, and that's really where the heart of the discussion is and should be taking place, and that is the politicization of European integration in party politics. Europe became an element of electoral competition in many countries in a way that is kind of unknown to us, and that has been occupying a lot of the work of time and attention of scholars working on electoral competition. And here what we see is that the traditional battles in politics, which used to be on this left-right spectrum over redistributive economic issues, are becoming more and more replaced by a political struggle that is on a second dimension, and that dimension has all sorts of names. I will use the name integration and demarcation. Sometimes it comes by cosmopolitanism or nationalism, or values, progressive values and more conservative values. Let me call it demarcation and integration. And this political dimension has drawn a lot of the party competition on an axis that previously wasn't used. And here, the centrist parties become identified as this undistinguishable centrist, left-right, unitary opinion. And other parties have been challenging this centrist blob in most countries by either being more open, more integrative, that's typically the case of Green parties, or more demarcated with a more nationalist agenda. And in some countries, this dimension is now becoming the real dimension of political struggle, which totally supersedes the left-right dimension. And you do not talk about redistributive issues anymore, because the question then turns towards a struggle over: do we want migration? Do we want integration in a supranational institution, or do we really want to go back to a community that we've known from several decades back? And that, in the end, is what I think is the most urgent item that we see in politics developing, but it also means that you can get a lot of different national variations of what the issue is and what the political issue is supposed to address. Because the Eurosceptic debate comes with very different, what we call in political science, party cues. Parties mobilize the image of Europe and the way in which they protest European integration, if that's how they challenge parties, political incumbents, with ways that are very different. The left parties that are Eurosceptic will use something that is more related to economic anxiety, anti-austerity programs, as you have in Syriza or Podemos, for example, in Spain. But the more right Eurosceptic parties will use something that is an anti-immigration theme, and it comes with a very different flavor. But these coexist. And that's important because if you have a democratic space that is supranational, you need to give space for these varying opinions and the party representation that this has at the national level, also at the European level. And I'll come in a second to why the diversity then is very important. So with these two general points, let me just comment in a way that will take up some of the points that have already been made by Henrik, the propositions that are in the TDEM treaty that Thomas has presented. The interesting thing that I can take from the publications, both coordinated by Henrik Enderlein and a series of economists and by Thomas, that both of them are very profoundly pro-European solutions. They try to address a problem by producing something that is more ambitious, that goes much further than what collectively we've been able to do so far, and that tries to fix a situation that is not very satisfactory. But in doing so, Thomas is even more ambitious than Henrik in imagining a European federal state system, which looks much, much less like an international organization than I think Henrik is willing to do, even though he's also pushing very far in that direction. But Henrik's focus in his publications have been a lot more on trying to overcome the negotiating stances of the French and the German government in order to move forward, and that's also how you heard in here make arguments about Ireland. They are from an intergovernmental negotiation tactic standpoint, whereas Thomas is about a finality. Thomas' proposals are about a finality, which I call, and it's just a shorthand, but a better functioning European federal state. Now, if you go into this federal state direction, and I say federal state, even though that's possibly not the word you would use, but it's because you propose to give fiscal capacity to the supranational institutions, the power to raise taxes. And that's one of the most sovereign functions political systems can have. Short of having the monopoly on violence, that's what defines a state, so it's a very important element that currently we're not granting to these supranational institutions, which somehow still are supposed to be more intergovernmental than an actual other state. Now, if you move into this direction and you're granting fiscal capacity to these supranational institutions, then we're coming very close to what I, from my home perspective, would call federalism, fiscal federalism, because then you would have to think about a system that organizes what part of these fiscal capacities are at the supranational level, in which configuration it may be. It might just be two countries that agree to levy a tax and redistribute it. It is something that needs to be coordinated with the other fiscal capacities you have at the national level. And if you have fiscal federalism, for a good federalist that the Germans would have to be, you have a fiscal constitution. And if you have a fiscal constitution, then you do need more than just a Eurozone treaty. You actually need something a bit more ambitious. And the Germans are comfortable with and wary of fiscal federalism because it's a nice thing to have. We live with it quite well, but it has a series of detailed points that need to be addressed that are already showing their head in the EU discussion, and that is how to organize subsidiarity, who's responsible for what, and how to organize fiscal transfers. If you have fiscal federalism, you always accept that there are fiscal transfers. And the way in which these fiscal transfers are organized are in the Constitution. But there's always challenges. You know all the challenges at the European level, but you probably are not aware that Bavaria, Baden-Württemberg, and Hesse is challenging in courts the equalization scheme in Germany quite regularly because Bremen is bankrupt, the Saarland is bankrupt, the East costs a lot, and there is a stream of money going from the rich to the poor Länder in Germany, just as you would expect things to happen in the European Union as well if we move to a more integrated fiscal system. So you need to think carefully about these elements, and the way in which they're being thought out in Germany always has the advantage and the downside that it's a very explicit system, but it's extremely slow. There are so many things that you can't do. We talk, by the way, about, if you like funky German words, I recommend Politikverflechtungsfalle and Reformstau. There are these elements that come with federalism, because the more you integrate it, the more you actually slow down the process, which is, I think, the opposite of what you would like to do by having an actually federal European budget to redistribute. If that was slow as well, then we're not closer to what I think is your main objective, and that is fiscal justice rather than democratization. And I'm saying that as my last point. I'm also saying because, like Henrik, I'm a bit unconvinced about the objective of democratization. I think what you want in the end is re-establish this left-right discussion that we see at the national level and we don't see at the European Union, and get more towards redistributive policy stances than what the EU, which is this liberalizing machine in the eyes of the critics, has not done so far. But by proposing to do this through a new assembly, I'm actually feeling that you're threatening what right now has been preserved as the democratic representation of the European institutions. And I say this for several reasons. The first is that your European Assembly would come, if one has a very long or broad way of counting, as the 5th representative assembly of the European Union. We have the European Parliament, which is sometimes considered the lower chamber of representation, but we also have the Council of the European Union, which represents the member states, but as a legislative body, so you can say in a federal system that would be the upper house. But we also have the Committee of Regions, which represents regional disparities and considers itself to be the second lung in the breathing system of the European Union, and they would like to call themselves the second chamber, but really they're the third chamber. And we have a fourth chamber, which is the European Economic and Social Committee, which is kind of a leftover of industrial relations of the 1950s and 60s, where trade unions and other social partners had a statutory representation. So here we now create a fifth one, which I think most citizens just will not understand. When is this assembly responsible for deciding over a budget? When is it the European Parliament? The European Parliament has fought hard to get competences over the budget and to be more useful. If you now then say, but there are certain type of taxes that are in the competence realm of some other part of that whole construction, I think you will do more to hurt the representation and the acceptance and the political legitimacy than actually help it. And the second is, and that's where I'm coming back to the populism debate, the way in which, and that's quite admirable, you lay out very detailed in the Treaty for the Democratization of Europe how many seats you would actually distribute to national members of national parliaments and European member of parliaments, leaves everybody counting how many seats would then be left by country. And for several countries, that wouldn't actually allow all nationalities to have all party colors that they have at the national level in this European Assembly. And then you have the European representatives who come from the European Parliament, and some of them, and the idea is that this makes them more responsive and actually aware that they're national representatives, but in a European Assembly as well. So I think you wouldn't have the entire spectrum of divergence on these 2x2 possible tensions in the electoral spectrum, and I think the parties will be the first to point that out and be concerned about it. And you also create something that we've kind of moved away from. The European Parliament used to be members of national parliaments sitting in Brussels until we went to direct elections after 1979. So we would move back to the national members of parliament having responsibility for supranational policy. And I don't think that would work to the same degree that it's also... First of all, we've tried it, and we've also done away with it within France, where double mandates have become very much out of fashion, because when you're responsible for two things, you're doing one of them less well than the other. So why would it work in this case? And that's the reason why I'm not convinced by this assembly proposal, even though I agree, and that's where Henrik and your proposal make a lot of sense and coincide. We do need to reform the fiscal capacities of the European Union and of the Eurozone. The Eurozone, it's urgent because it has to be more coherent with what we have in monetary policy. We do need to have a clear representative control of the European Parliament, and that's where I side with Henrik. And European Parliament as a controlling body can do several things. They can be a watchdog over the European Council. That's, I mean, if I would do the whole list, I would cite Olivier Rosenberg, who has, I think, 5 different functions of what parliaments can do. They can produce policy and maybe produce more redistributive policy. They can do other things as well. Usually they do so nationally. I think they can do so at the supranational level as well, but it is not through the creation of another assembly that this would be achieved. And I will stop here because I think I'm out of time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Maybe you would like to react, and after we will enlarge the discussion, because you have some challenge.
Yeah. So, you know, let me summarize the discussion. So you both feel that what we propose is too radical. You know, I think what you propose is far too conservative. And so, but, you know, I would like to work out a compromise. You mentioned that you were in favor to introduce national parliament members into a joint parliament with the European Parliament, but frankly, I did not understand exactly what you propose. And I have read your proposal and I still don't understand. And I think it's a problem because, you know, at least our proposal is clear. You know, we know what we propose. And I think, you know, there is a risk when being too conservative in the current EU context, and you know, the idea that basically we don't need to change too much because this is working, you know, the institution could work with the different, you know, political attitudes of the political actors. We've heard that for so long, you know, I've heard that, you know, I understand, it's not easy to understand, but I think it's just wrong, and I think it's been like this for too long. So let me just come back from your initial point you both made, that you're talking about democratization, but really you want to change the policy. Okay, I mean, the history of democratic change is an history where you create new policy space. And then, you know, what the institution will decide, of course, it's up to the political game. And once, you know, maybe the assembly that we propose to create will have a majority for zero tax and zero budget of any sort, and then, you know, I'm happy with it. Maybe it will vote a budget, you know, with a very right-wing majority, which I don't like too much. But still, I'm ready to go for it. You know, it's the institution will decide. So, you know, the history of institutional change is about this. You mentioned the US. Okay, one of the biggest constitutional change in the US was the 1913 amendment that made it possible to have a federal income tax. Okay, it did not prescribe the fact that there will be a federal income tax, but it made it possible. Until 1913, you know, you could have any majority you want in US Congress. No way you can vote a federal income tax. After the 1913 amendment, you could have a federal income tax. 10 years later, the top income tax rate was 90%, and it has been an average of, okay. So institutions matter for policy. It's full in history, so please reread the history of the United States. You will see that institutional change like this, of course, they did not imply a policy change in itself, but they create the policy space. And so I believe that political actors, you know, sometimes are constrained by institutions. I believe that even, you know, right-wing politicians in Germany would prefer to have a progressive tax on corporations where the small and medium-sized companies are not paying more than the large companies. So I think, and this is why in the end, I trust any majority that will come from this parliament, because I think in the end, opening the policy space to have a common taxation on certain tax, not on all tax, but, you know, we've done it all wrong in Europe, in the sense that when you have a large federal community, and I have no problem with the idea of, you know, talking about federalism, federation, fiscal federalism, yes, of course. When you have a large federal community, it makes sense that you're going to put at the center the tax instruments for which competition and mobility is the biggest. So typically in the US, what you do in the federal government is the progressive tax on income, the progressive tax on inherited wealth, the tax on large corporate profits, and then at the local level, at the state level, you have more indirect tax, you know, tax on consumption, a quasi-proportional tax on income, property tax, which are also quasi-proportional. Now in Europe, we do the opposite. You know, we put the VAT regulation at the center, and we let the individual member countries compete on the progressive tax. And then you're wondering why, you know, people in the bottom part of the distribution feel that this is not playing for them. You know, I think, you know, maybe one of the differences between you two and me is that you don't take seriously the fact that the European Union is working much better for the upper income groups than for the bottom income groups. You're not taking seriously the fact that, you know, I repeat my diagnostic, it is possible that already today, for the bottom 50% or the bottom 60% of citizens in France or Germany, the European integration, as it has been conducted, is a bad deal. But you see how, you know, how serious this is. So I think you're not taking seriously this possibility, because if you were taking seriously this possibility, I think you would realize that there is a need for a change. And I think having free trade, free capital flows, free everything without a common tax instrument is leading us to a catastrophe. And you know, coming back to the institution, I took the example of the US. Let me take an example in French history. You know, in 1789, you know, at the beginning of the meeting, you have three different assemblies. Okay, you have an assembly for the nobility, an assembly for the clergy, an assembly for the third estate, and each has veto power. This is the principle of the Estate General in the whole Kingdom of France. Each has veto power. Now, people in the third estate, of course, say, well, look, it's fine, but, you know, if the nobility has veto power, it's going to be difficult to have a tax system. So, indeed, they change institutions. They say, well, we're going to have one national assembly, please come, and then we'll take majority decision to change the tax system. And this is the beginning of the process. And if you know, so today, you know, Luxembourg is not exactly the nobility of you know, Europe, but what I mean is that so the context is obviously very different, but the common point is that when you have veto power by different, in effect, different national parliament, because in the end, what is the political legitimacy of the government in Luxembourg, the government in Germany? This is the Bundestag. This is the Parliament of Luxembourg. And so this is the current situation is a situation where each national parliament, in effect, has veto power through its government on common tax, etc. And so what we propose is to say, well, you know, certainly don't want the national parliaments to disappear. You know, they will keep voting most of the budget for foreseeable future, but for certain decisions, you want them to sit together so that instead of having a sequence of veto power, you can take majority decision, possibly qualified majority. You know, everything can be discussed, but at least you must create some space for this. Otherwise, you know, I just don't see. So in your scenario, so let me conclude by this, and let's try to better understand what you propose. You mentioned the possibility of putting national parliament members with European parliament members, which is what we do. So in our proposal, we have 80% of national parliament members in our European Assembly and 20% of European parliament members. If you want 50-50, if you want whatever, let's say it, and then I will understand what you propose. But why do we, and we are not saying 80%, 20% is the only possible compromise, you know, but we are, it could be, you know, it could be 50-50. I think it would be a mistake to have a very small role for national parliament members, because then you will have to explain me how does it work. You know, you're saying we should have more tax power to European Parliament, possibly with some national parliament members, but then you have to tell me what happens if the Council of Head of State doesn't want a certain tax decision that was adopted by this European Parliament, maybe restricted to a smaller number of countries. Who has the last word? And so there are two possibilities. Either you tell me, well, we keep like today, where both need to agree and the Council of Head of State needs to agree, but then I think you have not changed anything and we are going to be blocked just like we've been. And even if you have qualified majority rule for fiscal decision, in fact, you know, this upper chamber, as you say, will never be really a parliamentary chamber, because when you have one individual to represent 85 million German, one individual to represent 65 million French, etc., you know, how can you have a transparent, open, democratic decision and accept to be in a minority sometime, in a majority sometime? You know, it's just, it doesn't work. You cannot, when you represent 85 or 65 million people, you cannot return home and say, oh, too bad, I was in the minority, but, you know, maybe next time I will be in the majority. So this will just, it's not possible to take, you know, appeased majority level decision with such an institution. From the beginning, and the comparisons that we make with the US Senate makes absolutely no sense, because, you know, if the US Senate was made of the governor of New York, the governor of California, and if California and New York were 50% of the US GDP, like in the Eurozone, and you put the two governors in front with each other and you ask them to vote a US budget, you know, I can tell you this will be a big mess. It will never give rise to anything. And now this is what we are saying. So this is case number one, where you keep the veto power for the Council of Head of State. Now there's case number two, where you say, you know, you are being really federalist, and you say, well, I actually want the European Parliament to have real fiscal power, so they will have the last word. So I don't know if this is what you're proposing. You know, I've not read any precise proposal on this, and I think it's important to be precise. Now, if this is what you're proposing, then I find it more interesting. But then I think you need to put a lot of national parliament members into this assembly. Because if you take the extreme case where, you know, national parliament members are not in this parliament, or are a small part, you know, it would be a very strange situation from a constitutional and just logical viewpoint, because you will give, you know, full fiscal power to a European Parliament that is different from the national parliament members, but then the national parliament, if they are unhappy with whatever decision was taken by this European Parliament, you know, they have the biggest possible power, which is to leave the treaty. You know, as far as I know, you don't want to design a European constitution where it's impossible to live. You know, even the US tried to do it.
Ask the British how to do it. Yeah.
Well, that's the thing. Well, they are living. Okay. So,
are they?
Well, okay. Well, look, if you, look, this is certainly not something we can be proud of, what's happening in Britain. I think, look, this is a disaster for Britain, but this is a disaster for us as well. Okay, so it would be taking this as an example of, it's very strange to keep, the national parliament, the Bundestag or the Assemblée nationale will not stop having, fiscal power or power to sign international treaties or whatever. This makes no sense. So not involving them in voting common tax and then leaving them the possibility to leave the whole agreement if they disagree with what is voted makes very little sense. And I think this is why our proposal, as you say, Cornelia, in a way, is more federalist. It's more federalist. Why? Because in effect, it will transform national parliamentary election into European election. Because that will be saying, okay, if you want to become a national parliament member in France or Germany, you have to tell us what you will do in the European Assembly. Because part of you will be, or some of you in your political group, and maybe the number of seats for smaller countries needs to be increased so that all political groups are represented, including in smaller countries. But some of you will be represented, so you cannot just complain about Brussels all the time because you are not involved in the decision-making process. So I think, in effect, this is a way to Europeanize, European politics, and including national politics. Let me stop just by saying that there is, you are both German, but you are also French. There is another German who actually made this proposal that we are making in the Democratization Treaty a long time ago, whose name is Joschka Fischer, who was a Minister of Foreign Affairs, as you know, under Gerhard Schröder, who made a famous speech at Humboldt University in 2000, which people very often quote without reading it. And it's very short, it's only a couple of pages, so I advise you, go back home, go on the internet, look at the speech, you will see that Joschka Fischer is exactly saying, if we want fiscal integration, we have to create a new assembly using national parliament members. If we don't do it, if we continue with European Parliament, there will not be fiscal integration. And I think he was right. And I think it's sad that the French at the time did not respond. And I think it's sad that today the Germans don't respond when we talk about this.
Yes, we will.
Yeah.
May I?
They will.
Let me keep it quite short and simple because we want a wider discussion. Just a few points. The last point, when you talked about the taxing power of the European Parliament, I followed you and then you lost me in the end. Okay, so the European European Parliament in the treaty today has something like a built-in taxing power because the European Parliament or the European Union should have own resources. That is part of the treaty, and the Parliament, that's something you can derive, should decide on those own resources. If you have a spending power, and the European Parliament has to a certain extent spending power, it should have taxing power. I don't agree at all that the national parliaments need to be involved for decision-taking at the European level when it comes to taxation. We have direct elections for the European Parliament, we have direct legitimacy for them, so I think the European Parliament should get taxing power and decide how and where to use a certain tax amount.
What does it mean exactly
wait a second.
with respect to the Council of Head of State? I mean, can you
the Parliament, the way you could run this is you have the multi-annual financial framework discussion. National governments contribute to 50% of the EU budget, and the European Parliament decides on the revenue base for the second half of the EU budget and could actually go above that if it decided to increase the taxes. This is taxing power. And I'm totally opposed to involving national parliamentarians in this kind of taxing power at the European level. Point number one. Let me just stop. Point number two. I want national parliaments to be involved in the control function of the ESM and the Eurogroup when it comes to deciding on the surveillance functions of the European Union with regard to national fiscal policy making. This is an area in which we take away the crown jewel of national democracy by actually setting European rules at the European level, through the European semester, through the surveillance framework we have. And I think this is a context in which we lack democratic control, because the ESM is not controlled by any kind of body. The Eurogroup is not controlled by any kind of direct body, unless you take the legislative function of the Council. But I think this is where we need this joint committee of the European Parliament, bringing together European parliaments, parliamentarians and national parliamentarians. What we propose is that every Euro area member would send 2 national representatives, and the European Parliament appoints 19 or 38, if you want to have 2/3, 1/3, or 50-50, 19 or 38 members, and then the nationality of those members is of no importance. That's an issue in the European Parliament, whereby you cannot decide that a parliamentarian represents a certain country. They simply nominate a group of people sitting in that assembly. So you might have 57 members sitting there together and actually auditing or doing the surveillance of the ESM, doing the surveillance of the Eurogroup chairperson, and that possible new European finance minister, who has a double hat, would be in charge of the econ and financial portfolio at the European Commission, but also chair the Eurogroup. That's the legitimacy function. It's not the taxation function. It's 2 very separate things. And I think that proposal, in a certain sense, we're not in a competition about who is more federal, but I think it would be not very federal to involve national parliamentarians into deciding on European taxation. Your argument that you can leave, I think, is a weak argument. Bavaria never voted the German constitution. It actually voted against it. New York State rejected the US Constitution. So yes, they joined a fiscally federal system, and they don't like it, and they have to pay for it, but they still stay in the thing. If you want to leave, you can leave. This is why we have Article 50, and we now know how difficult it is to use Article 50. I'm happy if any other member state who is not happy with the taxation decisions of the European Parliament, which will always be minor, decides to leave the European Union. Good luck with that. You can't unscramble scrambled eggs, as we currently see. Now, a point with which I totally agree is the European side today lacks a social dimension. We agree on that, Thomas. There is a lack of the social dimension. I totally reject the accusation from your part to say, you are institutionally conservative, so you're politically conservative. That is not true. That was the point with which I started to say, institutions are separate from political content. So let's use our current institutions to change the European Union and make our system more social. I think we can do that. You just don't want to do it because you're not successful. This is why you want to create a new assembly. And I think that's not necessary. Franklin D. Roosevelt did not change the American institutions or constitution to introduce the New Deal. He just did it.
Well, the Supreme Court has to be changed, by the way. But, that's quite not a detail, you know. But you should reread the story.
I know. You want me to read history? I think that's a very easy argument to be put into place. We can also, for example, have a common deposit insurance in the European Union that would also work, and you would introduce a certain amount of new political dynamic in the system. I just think the problem. No, let me just finish.
I don't understand your taxation proposal.
I know that's very nice. Let me just end with one very important point. The proposal that you put on the table to circumvent the current institutions, and Cornelia was very outspoken on that point, is something that will not increase the democratic legitimacy of the European Union. I think it runs the risk of decreasing the democratic legitimacy of the European Union. Let's actually mobilize. We have many young people in the room. Let's mobilize voters in the upcoming European elections to make this a truly European election, to discuss the issues that you rightly put on the table, to say the European Union needs own resources. We need a redistribution mechanism. We might even need a joint unemployment insurance at the European level. But let's not, as I said, throw out the baby with the bathwater, create just another institution, because you are inviting me to read history. I'll write history at another point perhaps, but you invite me to read history. If you read the institutional history of the most successful countries, then institutional continuity is a key ingredient of economic success. Now, I know France has undergone many institutional changes, and there might be a temptation to change the institution to change policies, but since you were mean to me, I'm mean to you. Don't do it.
Well, I just want to ask you a simple question. I mean, there's been a lot of chaotic institutional change in Germany, of course, as well, and in the US. No, but in the US, you know, US history, federal history has not been simple. You know, there's a big civil war, the biggest war in US history. So anyway, I still don't understand your taxation proposal. So let me try to ask it again, and it would be great if you could answer. You know, we are making progress. I understand you want to put national parliament members for the surveillance of the Eurozone, but not for taxation. Good, I have understood this. So this is quite a big change already. So this, you want to make this big institutional change, but not for taxation. Okay. Now, for taxation, you're saying the European Parliament will have power. So what does it mean if they vote a tax and the Council of Head of State, they don't want it, what happens? What are you proposing on this? I still don't understand.
I can answer, but I want to clarify what I think is still a bit confusing. You called us conservative facing a radical proposal, but I don't think that's accurate. We're conservative institutionally. That's true because we want to keep pretty much the same institutions. The radical proposal I think that you're most attached to is not so much the institutional one, it is the policy space. And you cited the US 1913 amendment. An amendment to the Constitution is not institutional change. That's creating a policy space for fiscal capacity, and that is a policy content, is a policy innovation. There's no new assembly at that moment that was created. It was just the organization of the constitutional division of fiscal powers. And I think, the question you asked to Henrik was, how exactly do you govern tax if the European Parliament, and I don't think you should have national parliaments co-deciding with European Parliament members on taxation, because I think, like a German federalist, the way in which the sub-level governments get a say is through the second chamber. And here, for me, the second chamber is not the European Council, which has the heads of state. It is the Council of the European Union, which has, small detail, the ministers responsible for every one of the decisions. So, for example, if it's a tax that's supposed to change agricultural something, it's going to be the ministers of agriculture from the member states that co-decide with the European Parliament. And maybe if at one point we decide that really there should be something closer to the German system, we can increase that and not just have ministers, but have some national members of parliament there. But I'm not sure what that would really add. So I think the way in which fiscal federalism works in the countries that I know is that you say, what are the levels that are responsible for something? And here, the investment, for example, in your proposal, you say investment in higher education should be at the European level. Every German goes, ugh, because we have it at the vendor level.
To make sure I understand what you're saying, the Council of Head of State or the Council of Finance Minister for financial matter or the Council of whatever minister will still have their veto power on the decision.
Because they only have veto power if they have unanimity requirement, which they don't in many of the areas.
But Thomas, I think you get something wrong.
I'm very happy with this very lively discussion.
Ecofin, just one more. Ecofin doesn't have a veto over decisions of the European Parliament. Just not right. I need to answer in 2 minutes. It's going to be very technical and very boring. Blame Thomas. So the way the EU budget is set up, as some of you probably know, it's an interinstitutional agreement over a 7-year period involving the three key bodies that we described. Now, the question is, which of the powers would you give to the European Parliament? And the EU is, except for North Korea, probably the only country or federation that has a 7-year budget, a planning exercise. So we plan 7 years ahead. And we do this right now for the 21-27 financial framework discussion. What is happening is that the European Commission makes proposals which are discussed by the heads of state and which are then approved by the European Parliament in this interinstitutional agreement. The way this could work is that we leave a certain fiscal space for the European Parliament within which the European Parliament can decide freely. So in that sense, the European Council, which doesn't have a veto, and ECOFIN doesn't have a veto, would not be in a position to veto them. You could go over that space and say, if the EP raises less than 50%, there is a smaller budget. So the member states give in, we have a budget of around 1% of EU GNI or GDP. They're more or less equivalent. The technical designation is GNI. If the EU budget is 1% of GNI, you could say member states as a membership fee pay 50% of that 1% into the EU budget, as they do today, just you cap it there. For the remaining 50%, the European Parliament gets taxing power in certain areas. You could have a carbon tax, you could have a financial transaction tax, you could have a combination of those, and you would say, if the EP raises less because they are fiscally conservative, then they have only half of a percentage point of GNI to spend. If they raise more, then you need to go through the own resource ceiling, which currently is at 1.24 of GNI of the European Union. You could cap it there, or you could change the own resource decision and actually increase that to 1.5, meaning the European Parliament could, in theory, increase its taxing power to a full percentage point of GNI. So sorry for being so technical, but since you say it's not clear, it's the institutional context which actually puts a number of requirements on the table, but I think we can solve it. What is simpler, changing the current system or setting up a new parliament? I think that's the answer you need to give. I think it's simpler to work through the institution than to start from scratch because we don't like the current setup.
Well, I gave this example of the France-Germany assembly that Merkel and Macron were talking about 2 months ago because I think it's fairly simple. I think creating an assembly between France and Germany and possibly Italy, Spain to have a common tax, I think it's very simple to understand, much simpler than everything else you just explained. So I'm sorry, but when your argument that this will be too complicated and that the current institutions are there's already everything in them, to me, it's really not convincing. But at least now I better understand what you propose, which is, if I understand well, that on this 50% of the budget coming from own resources, the European Parliament, in your view, would have the final word over the Council, which makes the proposal a real proposal. But then this requires a big change in the treaty. If you want the Parliament to have the final word on this,
no. Well, no. The interinstitutional agreement is not. It's part of the treaty to make things simple. But if the Council decides in this interinstitutional agreement that the Parliament has the taxing power, you don't need to change the treaty.
If the Council decide not to have the power, then they don't have the power. Okay, but if they decide to take it back, they take it back.
No.
This is not.
The interinstitutional agreement has 3 veto powers. The European Parliament has never used its veto power in that respect.
Right.
But I think we should talk it.
EU is a very technical topic. There is
raised
a lot of passion, and that's so maybe now we will collect some questions. So you just have to move and maybe to ask you questions from the microphone, because we have less than half an hour, and I think you can go there and queue to ask you questions.
Hi, good evening. My name is Carlo, come from Italy, and very interesting conversation. Like, you showed us that politics is pretty interesting, and thank you very much. That's what we like. First question for Honorable Thomas Piketty. We have been talking a lot about taxes, but we haven't stated what we want to collect those taxes for. So, personally, I believe we got 2 main issues going on in Europe. The first are billionaires. Could you please, since you are an economist, telling me if billionaires are an example of market failure? We should really deal with them, because I think it's a problem to have them. So, if the European Union can do something with that. And the second would be I think that in Europe there are between probably 40-60 million people who are below the poverty line. I think that if the European Union was able to collect those taxes to go and help those people, that should be the kind of union that we need. Second point very quickly, for Honorable Professor Henrik Enderlein. I think you are playing with fire, and because No, like personally, like if you say that it might be the case that the populists are preventing from sitting in the European Commission, you probably don't understand what's happening right now in Italy. The populists are serious. If you say them, guys, yeah, okay, you were elected, but we will not allow you in the European Commission, I don't know what will come next. So this is a serious problem. And regarding Venezuela, very briefly, very briefly, we should not wait every morning for a guy in the White House to wake up and tell us what to do. So personally, I think that we should not be an extension of American foreign policy. So it's not that when the US decided something on Venezuela, we immediately go after them. So I think this is very important, and just this.
Thank you. Yes, you prefer to collect or to answer now?
Whatever.
Maybe, well, 3 questions, and after we will, 2 others, yes? Upstairs.
Yes. Does this work? Yeah, thank you. I'm Jacob from the Netherlands, and I have a question on I think it was Mr. Piketty who mentioned it, that the representation of the involvement of national parliamentarians in the European level more would also raise the profile of the European Union in the national debate. In fact, there is the Parliamentary Assembly in different organizations, in the Council of Europe, in the OSCE in Vienna. There is a Parliamentary Assembly, but this hasn't really raised the profile of these organizations on the national level. So would that be different for the EU because of it being the EU, or how would you look at it? How do you see this? Thank you.
The third one.
Hi, just as an American, a number of references have been made to the U.S. experience. So first, actually, New York State did ratify the Constitution in July of 1788. But more importantly, the issue of what belonged to the national government and what was left to remain to the states was not settled forever. It changed perpetually, and it changed largely as a function of conflict. So famously the Civil War, which not only got rid of slavery, but gave the federal government the authority over establishing citizenship and the right to vote. The change in the Constitution to allow income tax was driven by the growth of the federal government that needed it. These were not accidental. The Second World War had a profound effect on almost every feature of American life, largely with an expansion of federal authority and the diminishment of state authority. So what's going to happen is, and this is a point actually Immanuel Kant made, progress often comes out of crisis and war. So you need not solutions to begin with, you need crises. And those crises will inevitably push the EU to strengthen its more integrative claims and weaken the more local claims over authority. So that's the American prediction.
Thank you. So maybe you will answer these 3 questions, and after we will collect more questions.
Yes, so thank you for this question. So first question was about billionaire, and so is every billionaire a policy failure? I would not say it like that, but I think that if you have, it's okay to have rich people, middle people, poor people, as long as the gap are not too large, and also as long as each is growing more or less at the same speed, which is not what we've had, in recent decades in the US, but this is also not what we had in Europe, in the sense that top wealth holders, in particular large financial portfolios, have increased a lot faster than average wealth and middle wealth. And, this is something anybody can open a magazine to see that and, compare the number of billionaires, 10 years ago, 20 years ago with their own income or wealth. So this is something that is completely public. And at some point, when you have this level of awareness that a group of people is growing faster than the size of the economy, it's just common sense that you should ask a bit more tax from this group. It doesn't mean you need to expropriate them, but when you have a tax base that's growing faster than the size of the economy, you should not tax it less, you should tax it a bit more. How much more, this can be discussed, but now we're doing the opposite. Right at the time when this tax base was growing faster than the size of the economy, we decided to drop wealth tax. Now, to be exact, we still have wealth tax. You know, in France, there is a property tax called taxe foncière. In the US, it's called property tax. It's a huge wealth tax, except that it's not fair. It's proportional, or actually it's even regressive, because, you know, the way typical property tax would work in the US or in France is that you know, if you have an apartment that's worth 300,000 euros, if you have a debt, a mortgage of 290,000 euros, so you're not really rich, you know, your net wealth is only 10,000 and you have to pay interest like someone paying his rent to his owner for a long time. So you will be rich at some point, well, not really rich, but you will own something in 20 years. But for now, your net wealth is just 10,000 euros. You pay the same property tax or taxe foncière as someone who has no mortgage and who, in addition to his 300,000 euro apartment, has a 1 million euro financial portfolio. Now, this makes no sense at all. I can tell you there's no economic theory, no economic model, no economic reasoning, nothing of any kind that will tell you to do something like this. So at least, you know, the wealth tax, the progressive wealth tax, taking into account financial assets, you know, it was not working well, it was not enforced as well as it should have been. It could have raised a lot more revenue. You know, we lost 5 billion, we should have actually increased it to 10. By the way, the property tax foncière is 40 billion euro, and it has increased, you know, by 30% over the past 10 years, and nobody cares, you know, because it's about the poor people or middle class trying to access property. So, you know, these are not the friends of the party in power. Nobody cares. Okay, this is a pure scandal, and this makes no sense from an economic viewpoint. The only argument that could make sense, well, you know, there are lots of completely crazy arguments that have been invented to justify this, like, you know, financial investment create more jobs than real estate investment. But this is completely stupid. I mean, you build a building, you build a house, you create jobs right there, and you obviously create more jobs than if you invest your financial portfolio on the other side of the world or in some public debt. So, you know, when you start telling stories like this, which makes no sense at all, no sense, you know, this is really a problem, because it means that you are, you know, treating people like people who cannot understand, and you can tell them any authoritative argument and they have to accept. The only argument that could justify this will be a world where financial assets, they just can escape at zero cost. There's nothing you can do. You know, we just have to accept that rich people with financial assets, you will never catch them. And so the only people we can catch are people who have an apartment or a house in Enderlein, so let's catch them. Now, if this is your view of the world, you should not be surprised that people in front of you, you know, are going to break everything, because this is a kind of reasoning that is completely nihilistic and which is completely wrong. You know, let me tell you, you know, I have a little bit of financial wealth thanks to the fact that I sold a lot of books. So I put them at Société Générale in some, you know, life insurance account that is invested, I don't know, in public debt in Germany, in public debt. I don't want to know. They give me higher interest rate actually than normal people because it's a bigger account. I don't do anything. Macron, thanks to Macron, I don't pay the wealth tax anymore. Thank you, Emmanuel. Very nice of you. But, you know, the financial asset, you know, it's here at Société Générale Boulevard de Strasbourg. It can be, the information can be sent to the government just like for an apartment at Boulevard de Strasbourg. So the idea is that you cannot tax this, and the only thing you can do is, this makes no sense at all. So, you know, once you have this kind of view about the economy and taxation that is, you know, the mainstream view, and you know, you still, you know, the discussion sometime at the European Commission, at the IMF about wealth taxation, they say, well, yeah, real estate taxation is good, but, you know, financial assets, it's so complicated. You know, it's okay, so this was the answer on billionaire, which, you know, it's not that they are a policy failure, it's just that you need to have a system of taxation that is fair. And that you cannot fully exempt financial wealth and overtax, you know, the house and the apartments that people are trying to buy and access property, and, you know, real estate prices are very high, and it's difficult when you don't have family wealth and you only have your wage to become an owner. So you have to design a system. So what I would think we should do is to reduce the property tax and the wealth tax on people who have low net wealth and who are trying to access property. And pay it by increasing those who have a higher financial wealth. So, you know, let me be faster on the two other questions. You know, first question, the other question was, we already had parliamentary assembly in the past. It didn't do anything, so why would it make something? Well, the big difference is that, the parliamentary assembly in the past that you were mentioning are purely consultative assembly. They are parliamentary assembly to talk. And this was like this in Europe before 1979, so it didn't have any real power. So the big difference is if it gives you real power. So what is real power? Well, real power is money, is taxation. If you cannot write resources and then decide to spend it to invest in energy, to spend it in education, to use it to reduce other tax on other people, this is real power. If you give real power to a parliamentary assembly, I can tell you if Macron and Merkel say, okay, in the next 6 months, you put 50 members from Bundestag, 50 members from French Assemblée Nationale, and they have the power to vote a common carbon tax system, a common corporate tax for the two countries, you will hear a lot about it. If the treaty is really delegating this power to this assembly. So it's all a question of, is it just an assembly to talk, or is it real money, real power? Last question about the US, and if I understand well, your point was, the US system has changed a lot over time, and it was through crises, it was through wars, it was through huge crises, and so in Europe, it's good to talk about solution, but maybe what we need is not a solution, it's a crisis. Well, I think we need both. I think I would prefer to have the solution without the crisis, but in any case, I think it would be a mistake to just wait for the crisis because. In 2011, 2012, a new budgetary treaty was agreed upon in Europe in a couple of months. The negotiation went very fast because there was a financial panic when the interest rate on the French bond in September, October 2011 started to go to the sky, and there was an issue of what the European Central Bank will do in the future. There was a new budgetary deal. So I think the problem is that this was a bad treaty, because we had not talked enough about it. So I think, there will be other crises in the future. I don't know where they will come from. It's clear what we know now is that the 2012 budgetary treaty, it works today more or less because interest rates are close to zero. But with real interest rate, if real interest rate were 3 or 4 or 5%, say in Italy, the whole thing will explode immediately. Because the requirement of the treaty to go towards 0.5% GDP deficit in secondary deficit will mean a primary surplus of 2, 3, 4% GDP, and there's just no way any Italian government will pay such a surplus. So we know from the beginning. You can ask Italy to have a slight surplus, so how big is, 0.5%, 1%, but you're not going to have 3%, 4% surplus. But that's written in the treaty if the interest rate goes back to 3 or 4, 5%. So that will be, first obvious crisis if interest rate goes. And it's very difficult for the European Central Bank. Every time in the world there is a panic, you have lots of people in the world who don't know where to put their money. They go to the German bond. But then you have the German interest rate goes down, so the European Central Bank has to find some new way to avoid the spread with Italy to rise again. This is taking all the time. I think this system that was set up in 2012 is not working, is contributing to the low growth in Europe. And this is partly because we didn't talk about the solution enough before the next crisis.
I agree on the fiscal compact. I think this is very dangerous, the consolidation path which is built in, and I think we will have to review it. In the proposal by the 14 French and German economists, we propose to change the fiscal rule to have an expenditure rule, and I think that's much more reasonable than the debt reduction rule which is built in right now. I wanted to react briefly to one question Carlo, you, my Italian friend, I guess, brought up, this issue about playing with fire. And the European Parliament potentially rejecting commissioners. I didn't advocate this. I said the European Parliament could decide to do so. It would be a political decision. Normally, every executive represents the parliamentary majority and is not some kind of hidden second chamber. The European Commission, this is why I mentioned Coreper 2 earlier on, the European Commission is something like another intergovernmental body the moment the national governments decide who will represent them on the European Commission. Up to now, this was pretty much discussed away because we had a grand coalition left-right in the European Parliament, and the large majority of all governments in the European Union were either left or right, and so you could actually play with that. This time around, it's going to be difficult. We will have a representative from Italy who, in all likelihood, is going to be relatively Eurosceptic. The same applies to Poland. The same applies to Hungary. To some extent, depending on how you look at it, the same could apply to Greece. And so I think there is something to be discussed. But you're right, it's playing with fire. A second point on the US experience. Now, obviously, Bavaria also ratified the German constitution eventually. It's the initial reaction, I think, which is important. You sign up to a federal deal where you don't know how this will affect you financially. And all US states did it, all German lenders did it, and I think in the European Union we have not yet made this step, where the sovereignty over spending and expenditure is given away. And there, Thomas is absolutely right. The veto point of the European Council, or the heads of state, is still a decisive factor. I would like to break it, and I think this would be the founding moment of the European Union if we could have that break. I tried to explain through the technicalities that you can build it in stepwise, but that's the decisive thing. And once you've done that, this is why I quoted FDR, you can have a New Deal, which was the empowering factor in the US. I think before that, the federal budget, but you will probably correct me, the federal budget of the United States was something like 5% of GDP before the New Deal in the 1920s. And then the New Deal brought it up. So we're not that far away from the US experience with 1% of GDP today. But what we don't have today in Europe is this enabling power where a European politician like FDR could decide to actually step up the European financial capacity and thereby federalize the system. And I'm looking for this kind of breakthrough approach, which I think should work through the European Parliament as it worked through US Congress when the New Deal was adopted. These were the 2 points I wanted to answer.
So we will take another question, and maybe you can come there. Just first one.
So first of all, thank you all for coming tonight. I think we all can agree that has been quite an interesting discussion. So this question will be about identity in the European Union, which I believe, as you all as political scientists should know, is an essential tool or building part of actually building a sustainable union or just a sustainable political institution. How do you think that today we can continue building or create another assembly without having a real European identity? Most people view themselves through their national assemblies or national governments. How do you think that we can either create a European identity, which doesn't exist already, or how we can continue building it without it? Thank you very much.
Thank you. We will take the other one.
Yes, so this is more of a question for Thomas Piketty. There was a more left-wing response to the manifesto you've written coming from Varoufakis, to which you responded. But after your response, Stuart Holland and also James K. Galbraith came in his defense. And their idea was moving towards Eurobonds, and not just Eurobonds coming from the European Central Bank, but also the European Investment Bank and the European Investment Fund. You said that is part already of the Juncker plan, but we know the Juncker plan did not dedicate 300 billion in those terms. And basically, their point was that we need rather monetary easing than tax planning. And you managed to respond to Varoufakis, but not so far to Holland and to James K. Galbraith, from what I know. So what is your position after those critiques on the issue? Thank you.
Third one, small one.
Yes. Would you agree to say that difference between you, to sum it up like that, is that Mr. Piketty, you think that the European Parliament is not able, not legitimate, not in a capacity to create a genuine, real system of taxation at the EU level? On Henrik, you think it's possible. I understand that you wish it would be possible, but you also think in the short future it's something that we could see during our life.
Maybe we can take close the discussion just a
Yeah.
minute.
Yes, thank you again for all of your insights. I have a specific question for Mr. Enderlein. You mentioned that there's a specific political change needed by France and Germany, and you rejected that it's not going to be Spain, it's not going to be Italy, it's not going to be the UK. And I was wondering, how would you envision that this French-German motor would be able to convince the other 25 remaining member states? I mean, the Nordic countries, including Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, all these countries, and also the Eastern member states. How do you imagine that the French-German motor would be able to convince them? Yes, thank you.
The last one.
Hello. My question is actually linked to the debate you had about whether we should create smaller institutions or not. We know that to be strong and to be efficient, the European Union needs to regroup as many countries as possible to be able to compete with other large superpowers such as the US or China. But seeing how the interests and the will of European countries such as Poland and France on some topics are sometimes opposed, how can we keep this regroupment of countries and be able to create joint regulations and joint legislations? Thank you.
Okay. The first question was the identity question. And it was asked to you, but I think if we solve it for the new assembly Thomas is proposing, then you can solve it for the European Parliament. I think the European Parliament can have this kind of identity building function if it's rightly applied. And this is why I look forward to this European election campaign, because it's the moment you shape this kind of general identity. I would be much more skeptical about setting up a new identity through a new institution, but you will not be surprised to hear that. That relates to Olivier Rosenberg's question about what can the European Parliament achieve in the short run? So I think you're right in describing how we look at it. I think the EP exercises some kind of self-restraint, or has exercised some kind of self-restraint in the past. The question is whether there will be a moment where the EP itself decides to be much more political. And the moments of the financial perspectives, as they were called before, and the multi-annual financial framework now, where the Parliament has to agree, is a very important moment. I mentioned it's an interinstitutional agreement with veto power. So the Parliament could request to be at the table from day one, but they've never asked for that. They've always said, you know, you heads of state decide, and we will put our signature below that treaty. They don't need to do that. They can do that. But so I think the politicization of the European Parliament, the Commission, and therefore the European system is really the decisive next step we need to go in the European construction. And on that path, I think it would be a diversion to actually leave this existing institutional framework aside and try to find a workaround. Let's enable the European parliamentarians. That would be my main point. One word on Eurobonds. Again, it's a question to you. You know, if I look at this debate with Varoufakis, with you, with many others, it's a debate very much inside a bubble. And my concern is coming from Berlin, and I'm certainly not the typical German. I advocated Eurobonds, I was fighting for Eurobonds, I was fighting in Germany for the support of Greece, so I'm not one of these people clearly rejecting that. You will not even start a discussion in Berlin about these tools. You need to find a workaround. I would change the terminology to safe assets. It sounds nicer and words matter. You will have a synthetic safe asset. There have been proposals on the table. That's something the German government will consider or at least debate. If we start to discuss Eurobonds, we're really on Mars and Venus, and there is no discussion possible. And that's part of the difficulty of the politicization that you have pushed and others have pushed, that we actually drive the worlds apart. And you are rightly calling me on that front a conservative. I want a pragmatic, step-by-step progress for the European Union and not the clash of political cultures and ideas that ultimately drives the European Union apart. I think this is pragmatism, but we need pragmatism in the European context. And that also relates to the question about the Franco-German axis. It's very well asked. So can France and Germany decide something and then pull the other 25? It's an absolutely legitimate question. My answer would be, I believe they still can. but the proof of the pudding is in the eating. We just need to try. I think if France and Germany agreed on a joint legislation for the ethics of artificial intelligence, other countries would follow. And in that sense, being the core countries, assuming Britain leaves, in the European Union framework and deciding on setting the agenda and moving forward would really shape this European continent and push it forward. And this is why I enjoy being on Franco-German panels and I enjoy being in Paris, even if we have many, many discussions. Thank you.
I have a small point, and I will pass the floor to Thomas, who should have the last word. I just wanted to make a comment because I think I understood the question about identities quite differently, and maybe it was me who misunderstood it. But there is a challenge for any political system, and of course any assembly, that is that people have to identify with it and feel that they're represented by it somehow. And the main criticism that's always been made of the European Parliament is that there is no political space in which the political battles of the European Parliament reflect anything about what citizens actually like. And I would kind of stop on a positive note. I think that the European elections we see coming up now are innovative in the sense that for the first time the issues that are debated on by the parties that are running platforms on the European elections are truly about questions of European integration. I think the closest we've ever come to not having second-order elections, as we call them, is this particular European election. We do see struggles over what Europe is, what it should be, that have a left flavor or a right flavor depending on where you look, but we will have a composition that actually more reflects what the different opinions are in the European Union. I think that is a positive thing. So I just wanted to throw that in, but I will give you the last word.
Okay, thank you. So there are at least three questions, one on identity, the other on Varoufakis Eurobonds, and the other one on the legitimacy of the EP, the European Parliament. So identity, I think identity is it's a very complex issue. This is partly shaped by policies, socio-economic policies, institutions. There's of course there's nothing natural in identity. The fact that people in Bavaria feel more solidarity with people in Saxony than with people in Greece. So this is also made by history, institutions that make people feel that they have something in common and that they can benefit from a common policies. And my diagnostic is that today, we are just starting. We have in some way we have not even started really to build what should be a common identity, and that this can only work, I think, by starting, more integration, and in particular more fiscal integration and more common policies with a smaller number of countries, basically. And well, if everybody wants to come in right away, that would be fantastic. But I think this is not realistic. I think, it will, in my view, we probably need quite a long period of time where.
Mesdames, messieurs, nous vous informons que le bâtiment va fermer ses portes dans quelques minutes.
Okay.
Merci de bien vouloir commencer à vous diriger vers la sortie.
So let me.
This is hard enforcement.
Ladies and gentlemen, we inform you that we shall close within a few minutes.
So let's.
Starting to go to the exit.
So, the bottom line is that I think we have to start with a smaller number of countries, France, Germany, Italy, Spain. It will be a subset of countries within the Eurozone, and then at some point the 27 countries will want to have common tax, but the idea that this is going to work right away with the 27 or 28 countries, to me, is not pragmatic at all. To me, it is what we've tried for a long time, and I don't think that's going to work. So, just on Varoufakis and Eurobonds, let me say that, our proposal is very incomplete in many dimensions, and in particular what it says about money and debt, which are pretty important issues, is very insufficient. There's one article on pooling debt over 60% of GDP and having a common safe instrument.
Le bâtiment ferme ses portes immédiatement.
But this is.
De bien vouloir vous diriger vers les sorties.
Okay, but there is too little.
We are closing right now. Thank you for going to the exit.
So we need both debt and taxation, to summarize. But I think it's a bit too easy for Varoufakis and Galbraith to say that taxation is not important and that we're going to solve everything with debt. And I think it's a problem with the fact that the European Central Bank has created so much money, from 10-15% of GDP in its balance sheet to now 40% of GDP, 25% GDP in 10 years, it is 2.5 per year. It is almost 3 times the EU budget. So people feel that, you have all this money here, why should you need taxation? And I think this is a problem. But I think in the end, taxation is important, and it's a bit too easy to say we're going to get everything with debt. Okay.
Thank you very much. I think that we had a really lively, interesting discussion, and thanks to our 3 speakers. So thank you very much. They are discussing.